Week 14, which means the fantasy playoffs are just 1 week away. So with that in mind, I thought it would be a helpful exercise to start to understand the matchups ahead of us. Which defenses are exploitable and for which position, which defenses present the most difficult matchups and may be the ones to avoid in certain situations as well. Of course, matchups aren't the end all be all, they're just a part of the puzzle. I'm not going to recommend that you sit Jamar Chase because he has a tough matchup or trade Saquon Barkley because his fantasy schedule is fierce. But it can make the difference on the margins, and it is important to understand. We're also going to go position by position to find the easiest and the most difficult schedules for the duration of the fantasy playoffs, weeks 15, week 16, week 17. And we're going to talk about how you should be handling each individual situation. So if you're ready, sit back, strap up, and let's go on a title run. Welcome into Title Run. I am Alex Johnson. We are continuing our 6-week journey on our path to fantasy greatness. And today we're going to look at the best and the worst matchups and the best and the worst schedules for the fantasy playoffs. So let's just start. Let's start by taking a quick look at the defenses that we can exploit. These are the matchups. These are the individual. We'll get into the schedules a little bit later. These are the teams that we want to exploit, that we want to target during the fantasy playoffs based on position and how these teams have performed throughout the season against individual positions, of course, adjusted for opponents. I ranked these according to schedule adjusted fantasy points per game allowed via the fantasypoints.com tool that they have. I recommend checking that out. So the easiest matchups for running backs, these are the defenses that we want to play our running backs against. It's the Panthers. The Panthers are the easiest matchup for running backs. You don't need me to tell you this. Play all your running backs against the Panthers. Running backs have been torching the Panthers all year. Also the Bills. The Bills are giving up a ton of fantasy points to the running back position. They're the second easiest opponent for running backs. Then it's the Jaguars at third. Giants, Colts, Buccaneers, and Bears. Play your running backs against those teams. As for wide receivers, the easiest matchup has actually been the Vikings. I know that the Vikings defense has gotten, this reputation of being a fierce defense. They confuse quarterbacks. They shut down running backs, but they've actually been the easiest matchup for wide receivers. And there are a lot of reasons for that, game script and, the way that they play defense. Yeah, it's aggressive and it forces a lot of sacks and such. But teams are forced to be in comeback mode, throw the ball against this Vikings defense that brings a lot of pressure. And any quarterback that can handle that pressure, get the ball out quick, they're going to succeed. So wide receivers have done well against the Vikings. Same thing against the Jaguars. We want to play all of our wide receivers against the Jaguars. The Ravens are the number 3 easiest matchup for wide receivers. Falcons, Bengals, Buccaneers, and Lions. Play your wide receivers against those teams. Now for quarterbacks are scoring the most against the Jaguars. We want to play our quarterbacks against the Jaguars. So if in the fantasy playoffs you see that your quarterback is going against the Jaguars, you want to start that guy. If you're streaming quarterbacks and you're looking ahead to the fantasy schedule, the fantasy playoff schedule, look to see who the Jaguars are playing. Who are the Jaguars playing? We'll get into that and pick up that quarterback, stream that quarterback against the Jaguars. Same thing against the Buccaneers. They're the second easiest matchup for quarterbacks. Then it's the Bengals, Cowboys, Panthers, Ravens, and the Raiders. Now, for tight end position, we want to play our tight ends against the Panthers. Just across the board, play everybody you got against the Panthers. Same thing with the Colts. Now, the Chiefs have been a really tough defense this year. However, their weak spot has been against the tight end position. So if you got a tight end going against the Chiefs, you don't have to bench that tight end. You don't have to be worried about that matchup. You can actually exploit that matchup. Play your tight ends against the Chiefs. Same thing with the Raiders, Packers, Jaguars, and Buccaneers. Play your tight ends against these positions. Now, on the other side of things, we want to look at the difficult matchups, the tough matchups. The toughest matchup for running backs has been the Chiefs. You know, that's going to be a theme here. You can play your tight ends against the Chiefs. You definitely don't want to play your running backs against the Chiefs. You don't want to play them against the Lions either. You don't want to play them against the Lions. The Lions are a pass funnel defense. Their run defense is really strong. Their secondary is fine, but their secondary gets exploited because, one, these teams are in comeback mode, so they're forced to throw the ball more. And then their run defense is so good that teams are like, you know what, we're not even going to try to run the ball. So that's going to factor into how teams are playing their running backs against the Lions. Game script is part of this. It's not just that the Lions defense is that good. They are, but game script is part of it as well. That's the Browns, Vikings, who we mentioned earlier. They're a tough matchup for running backs. Eagles, Texans, Commanders. Just be wary of playing your running backs against those teams. Now, of course, we're not sitting studs. We're not sitting Saquon Barkley. We're not sitting, Derrick Henry because he has a tough matchup. This is on the margins. If you're streaming the position or if you have a couple of options that you're debating against, this is where that can be a tiebreaker. Looking at the wide receiver position, tough against the Eagles. They're the number one matchup or toughest matchup for the wide receiver position. That's the 49ers, Bears, Jets, Steelers, Dolphins, and the Titans show up here. The Titans have actually quietly been a pretty good defense this year. I know it didn't seem like it last week against the Commanders, but there was a lot of turnovers and such in that game, which led to the demise of the Titans. But the Titans have been a little bit of a difficult matchup for the wide receiver position. For quarterbacks, toughest matchup for quarterbacks has been the Steelers. Then it's the Bills, the Eagles, Dolphins, Bears, 49ers, and the Packers. Then tight ends, it's the Giants. The Giants have been the toughest matchup against the tight end position this year. That's kind of wild. And of course, this is not a situation where, they just haven't played any good tight ends. Not one of those. This is adjusted for opponent. The Giants have been the toughest. Then it's the Chargers. The Lions show up here again. 49ers, Bills, Jets, and again, the Eagles. Difficult matchup for tight ends, those 7 teams. All right, let's get into what we really came here for. We came here to go position by position, toughest and easiest schedules for the fantasy playoffs. So, let's get into the easiest schedule for running backs for the fantasy playoffs. The number one easiest schedule for the running back position for the duration of the fantasy playoffs is the Detroit Lions. The Lions in week 15, they play the Bills, who are the second easiest matchup for running backs. The Bears are the 7th easiest running back matchup for running backs in week 16. And then the fantasy championship, they get the 49ers, who are kind of like a middle of the pack. But you know what? The 49ers at that point, they're probably going to be eliminated. They've been stacking up injury after injury after injury on both sides of the football. They might be packed up and ready to end the season at that point in week 17. And even at this point, they're already just middle of the pack anyway. They're not a tough enough matchup or an easy matchup. You can play your running backs in week 17. You can play your Lions running backs against the 49ers. So obviously we are taking advantage of this Lions schedule with Jahmyr Gibbs. This is a guy who doesn't need the backfield to himself to put up top 10 fantasy numbers. He's currently RB6 in fantasy points per game. He's averaging 18.1 points per game. And that was after being the RB8 as a rookie last year. Jahmyr Gibbs is good. Jahmyr Gibbs is going to trend towards being a league winner. This is a fantastic schedule for him in the fantasy playoffs. And of course, his running back mate, Dave Montgomery. He's also a top 12 running back in fantasy points per game. He scored 11 touchdowns in 12 games. This guy doesn't know how to not score touchdowns. And he's also on his way to another 1,000-yard rushing season. So fire up Jahmyr Gibbs and Dave Montgomery. Play him in the fantasy playoffs. You don't need me to tell you that. But if you have those guys, you got to be excited for the fantasy playoffs. Now, the second easiest schedule in the fantasy playoffs for the running back position are the Cardinals. So they got the Patriots in week 15. They're the 12th easiest matchup for the running back position. And then we talked about the Panthers in week 16. The Panthers are the easiest matchup for the running back position. You want to play all your running backs against the Panthers. So in the semifinals, you're going to want to fire up James Conner for sure. Then in the fantasy championship week 17, it's the Rams, who are the 14th easiest matchup for the running back position. So obviously we're taking advantage of this with James Conner. He's one of the most consistent players at the running back position. He's top 15 in carries and in targets among running backs. And he's the RB17 in fantasy points per game. Now, the Cardinals should get out to a lead against both the Panthers and the Patriots, which will likely turn into a very James Conner-friendly game script in both of those matchups. If you have James Conner, dude just got paid. He's playing well. He somehow has stayed healthy. If that maintains throughout the rest of the year, he's going to be a big contributor to you winning a fantasy championship. Now, we know the injury history of James Conner. He has literally never played more than 15 games in a season. He's only played more than 13 games in a single season one time in his career. So that means we still need to be stashing Trey Benson. Trey Benson is one of the top handcuff running backs in fantasy football. He would be a league winner with this schedule. If anything were to happen to James Conner, you must stash Trey Benson for the fantasy playoffs. He could be a league winner at any moment if anything happens to James Conner. Fantastic schedule, great player, third-round pick, explosive, big running back. Stash Trey Benson. The third easiest schedule for the running back position is the New York Jets. They get the Jaguars with the third easiest matchup for the running back position in week 15. It's the Rams in week 16, and it's the Bills in week 17. The Bills are the second easiest matchup for the running back position. Take advantage of this with Breece Hall. Breece Hall he's kind of been up and down throughout the year. That's pretty much thanks to what has been mostly a dysfunctional Jets offense. However, Breece Hall is fully equipped to absolutely torch bottom of the league run defenses if given the chance. Now we know he's battling a little bit of a knee injury right now. He didn't really look right in week 13. That means we need to keep Braylon Allen stashed on our bench just in case, because if he becomes the number one running back in that offense, he has that same easy schedule, guys. He's got the same easy schedule that Breece Hall does. He could be a league winner if he was thrust into that RB1 job. So keep Braylon Allen stashed. The fourth easiest schedule for the running back position are the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Week 15, they get the Chargers, who are the 19th easiest schedule or opponent. Cowboys in week 16. And then there it is again, the Panthers were the easiest matchup for the running back position. They get the Panthers in week 17. Fire up Bucky Irving. Fire up Rachaad White for the fantasy championship. Bucky Irving, he's kind of emerged as the number one guy in this two-headed Bucs backfield. He's even started to take a good chunk of the receiving work away from Rachaad White. That's a concern for Rachaad White owners, but it's great for Bucky Irving managers. Rachaad White came into the league as a great pass catching running back. That's what he does best. That's his bread and butter. He's done well with that in the NFL. So Bucky Irving is also starting to eat into that work. We could, with this schedule, we could get league winner Bucky Irving. So make sure you are firing up Bucky Irving with confidence throughout the fantasy playoffs. He could be that guy that you need on your fantasy championship roster to win it all in week 17. Now, I do believe Rachaad White is still going to get enough work to be like a weekly RB3. And if anything happens to Bucky Irving, he's going to thrive. So keep stashing. And maybe in certain situations, you can start Rachaad White. Now, there's a third guy in that backfield, Sean Tucker. He's kind of an interesting stash in deeper leagues just in case something happens to Bucky Irving or Rachaad White. He would have a role in that backfield if either of those guys were to go down. Now, we're going to do five schedules for each position. So the fifth easiest fantasy playoff schedule for the running back position are the Tennessee Titans. Week 15, they get the Bengals, who are kind of, they're kind of an okay matchup. They're more of a pass funnel defense than, a great matchup for running backs. But I'm not hesitating to play my running backs against the Bengals, but it gets easier from there. Week 16, it's the Colts for the fifth easiest matchup for the running back position. Then in the fantasy championship round, week 17, it's the Jaguars who have the third easiest matchup for running backs. So we're going to take advantage of this with Tony Pollard. Tony Pollard, he's kind of become a little bit game script dependent, as we kind of saw there in week 13. But the Titans should play it pretty close against the Colts and the Jaguars in week 16 and week 17. So there should be plenty of opportunities for him to exploit two of the bottom five defenses against a running back position. I'm going to keep riding Tony Pollard with confidence through the fantasy playoffs. I think he could help you, especially in the semifinals and the finals, help you win that championship. Let's move on to the wide receiver position, the easiest schedule in the fantasy playoffs for wide receivers. That goes to the Las Vegas Raiders. They have the easiest schedule for wide receivers. Week 15 is it's the Falcons, who are the fourth easiest matchup for the wide receiver position. Week 16, it's the Jaguars, who are the third easiest matchup for the wide receiver position. And then week 17, fantasy championship week, it is the Saints, who are the 11th easiest matchup for the wide receiver position. Now, of course, there's not a lot to take advantage of in Las Vegas, but I do like me some Jacoby Myers at the wide receiver position. He's really the only Raiders wide receiver worth rostering because we know Brock Bowers is a tight end. Myers is quietly wide receiver 19 in fantasy points per game. He's scored at least 13 PPR points in 6 of his last 8 games without Devontae Adams in the lineup. He's seen at least 10 targets in 4 of his last 7 games. Obviously, we can translate this over to Brock Bowers as well, but you don't need me to tell you fire up Brock Bowers with confidence no matter what. But the schedule will help Brock Bowers as well. The second easiest schedule in the fantasy playoffs for the wide receiver position are the New York Giants. Week 15 is the Ravens, who are the third easiest matchup for wide receivers. A lot of that is game script. Their secondary is not great, but their run defense is really, really good. And their offense is really, really good. So opponents are forced to throw the ball a lot against the Ravens, which of course is going to help wide receivers score more fantasy points. That could be the case here for the Giants in week 15, especially if we have Drew Lock at quarterback. I feel a lot better about it. He's going to start in week 14, so hopefully he'll continue to play throughout the fantasy playoffs as well. Because week 16 is the Falcons, who are the 4th easiest matchup for the wide receiver position, and the Colts, who are the 15th easiest matchup for the wide receiver position. Giants get them in the fantasy championship week. So obviously we're only taking advantage of this with Malik Neighbors. I have really very little interest in Wan'Dale Robinson or even a deeper guy like Darius Slayton. I just want Malik Neighbors. I don't think any quarterback, no matter who it is, whether it was Daniel Jones earlier in the year, whether it's Drew Lock, Tommy DeVito, I don't think there's really a Giants quarterback who can support consistently at a high level more than one wide receiver for fantasy purposes right now. So we're just going to focus on Malik Neighbors. Malik Neighbors continues to just get peppered with targets, no matter who is out there throwing the football. He's third among wide receivers in targets. He's first in target share. And he's fourth in receptions. And he's still wide receiver 8 in fantasy points per game. And the third easiest schedule for the wide receiver position in the fantasy playoffs are the Tennessee Titans. It's the Bengals in week 15. They are the 5th easiest matchup for wide receivers. Week 16 is the Colts, who are the 15th easiest matchup for wide receivers. And then in the fantasy championship week, the Titans get the Jaguars. They are the 2nd easiest matchup for wide receivers. Take advantage with Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley has 2 top 5 weeks and 4 top 30 weeks in the 6 games since DeAndre Hopkins was traded. He's been awfully close to a few more big plays along the way as well. And we can also look towards Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. He has seen a target share of at least 20% in 3 straight games. He's been a touchdown machine. The dude doesn't know how to not score touchdowns at this point. Now, I know touchdown regression is definitely going to hit Nick Westbrook-Ikhine eventually, but he's going to remain relevant as long as those targets keep on coming. The target share has been there. So we got to keep looking at Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. That's a really great schedule for the fantasy playoffs. The 4th easiest schedule in the fantasy playoffs for the wide receiver position are the Chicago Bears. Week 15, they get the number 1 easiest matchup for wide receivers. That is the Vikings. We talked about them earlier. They are a pass funnel defense. There are a lot of reasons for it. In week 16, it's the Lions. Same thing. They're the 7th easiest matchup for wide receivers. Week 17, it's the Seahawks, who are kind of like middle of the pack there, 17th. But we can take advantage of this with DJ Moore. He's averaging 10 targets per game and 88 receiving yards per game in the 3 games since Shane Waldron was fired. And Keenan Allen is also averaging 10 targets per game since the Waldron firing as well. So we can start playing Keenan Allen with a little bit more confidence moving forward, which is great to take advantage of this schedule throughout the fantasy playoffs. And he's kind of looked good. He's looked good over the last few weeks. Now, Rome Odunze is interesting. Rome Odunze is the 3rd wide receiver in Chicago. He only actually has 4 fewer targets than DJ Moore since the Shane Waldron firing. He's got 26 targets to DJ Moore's 30 in those 3 weeks. He's kind of a fringe play right now, but he's going to be a starter if anything happens to either DJ Moore or Keenan Allen. So I've been saying it all year. I hope it pays off at some point. Keep stashing Rome Odunze. That's a really good playoff schedule for him. Now, the 5th easiest schedule in the fantasy playoffs for the wide receiver position. Green Bay Packers, week 15 is the Seahawks, who are the 17th easiest matchup. The Saints, who are the 11th. And then the Vikings, who we just mentioned, they are the number 1 easiest matchup for the wide receiver position. Take advantage of this with Jaden Reed. Jaden Reed, clear number 1 wide receiver in Green Bay. He may be a little bit inconsistent. We know that. But just lean into that volatility, man. Lean into that volatility. He can provide week-winning performances at any time. I know he can give you like a 3 at any time as well, but you're not going to win fantasy championships by being afraid of a guy like Jaden Reed. He could be the reason why you win one of these weeks. I'm looking at week 17 against the Vikings. He could do really, really well. He leads all NFL wide receivers in receptions of more than 20 yards so far this season. Now, going a little bit deeper, Christian Watson, he's kind of like a dart throw in deeper leagues in the hopes that he connects on a big play. He's kind of fringy, but if it comes down to a tiebreaker, maybe you want to play Christian Watson in one of these favorable matchups. Same with Romeo Doubs. He's also a fringe wide receiver. Kind of has his moments here and there, but he's kind of he's even riskier, I think, than Christian Watson at this point. But he has very little upside on any given week. I'm probably not interested in playing Romeo Dobbs, despite the schedule. Now let's move forward to the quarterback position. The easiest schedule for quarterbacks is the Tennessee Titans. They got the Bengals in week 15, the Colts in week 16, and the Jaguars, who are the number one easiest matchup for the quarterback position. They get the Jaguars in week 17, fantasy championship week. I know what you're thinking. Are we really gonna consider Will Levis in the fantasy championship week or any of the fantasy playoff matchups? It's a risk. I know it's a risk, but there are leagues out there. There are leagues out there where people need players like Will Levis to come through in the fantasy playoffs. They're going to count on a guy like this. They're streaming the position. And Will Levis, he's kind of quietly been playing kind of decent lately. Over the last 4 weeks, he has a passer rating of 101.4. He's number 2 in yards per attempt, and he's top 10 in both passing yards and passing touchdowns over the last 4 weeks. I know it's crazy. It's Will Levis. I know he's going to crash and burn at any time, but if you're streaming the position, man, he can absolutely take advantage of this upcoming schedule. He can do it, especially when we look at week 15 against the Bengals, who should create a negative game script from pretty much the beginning of that game. I think Will Levis is a legitimate streaming candidate in week 15 against the Bengals. Fire him up, baby. Fire him up. Fire him up. Now, we're also looking at the Raiders, who are the number 2 easiest schedule for quarterbacks, the Falcons, Jaguars, and Saints. Now, I know despite the schedule here, Aiden O'Connell probably really would keep him off the streaming radar outside of like the deepest of deep leagues or super flex leagues. Instead, we're going to take advantage of this schedule in the form of Brock Bowers and Jacoby Myers, as we talked about earlier. The third easiest schedule for the quarterback position in the fantasy playoffs are the Panthers. This is another one, kind of a fringe play here. Bryce Young. They get the Cowboys in week 15, and they're the 4th easiest matchup for the quarterback position. That's the Cardinals and the Buccaneers, who are a number 2 easiest matchup for the quarterback position. And Bryce Young has kind of looked like a different quarterback since returning from his early season benching. Whether or not he's the future of the Panthers franchise, that's kind of a topic for a different day. We're not going to get into that. I do have my thoughts on that, but we'll get into that on a different show. But it's clear he has improved. He's gotten better. There's no doubt. You can't argue. Bryce Young has gotten better. Now, it hasn't fully translated to fantasy production, but he has thrown for more than 260 yards. He's been a top 15 quarterback in back-to-back weeks heading into week 14. That includes last week against the Buccaneers, who he will see again in the fantasy championship week. I'm just saying. Deeper leagues, streaming the position, has a little bit of confidence. You can have a little bit of confidence in playing Bryce Young in the fantasy playoffs. The 4th easiest schedule for the quarterback position in the fantasy playoffs are the Dallas Cowboys. You got the Panthers, Buccaneers, and then the Eagles. The Eagles are a tough matchup, but week 15, week 17, those are really good matchups, both top 5 matchups against the position. Obviously, Cooper Rush has done well, pretty much about as well as you could expect from a backup quarterback on a bad team. He's finished as a top 20 fantasy quarterback in 2 of his 4 starts. He's not really on the streaming radar outside of the deepest leagues, though, so I'm probably not really considering Cooper Rush, but there are places where you need to consider him. There you go. Good schedule, at least a week 15, week 16. And the 5th easiest schedule in the fantasy playoff for the quarterback position are the Los Angeles Chargers. Buccaneers were the 2nd easiest matchup. They get them in week 15. That's the Broncos, who kind of towards the bottom. They're not that great of a matchup, week 16. But then it's the Patriots in week 17. So week 17, they're the 8th best matchup for the quarterback position. Justin Herbert's been hot. Justin Herbert has been hot. The Chargers are passing a little bit more. He's kind of built a connection with rookie Ladd McConkey. Now, prior to week 13, Justin Herbert had scored as a top 12 fantasy quarterback in 5 straight games. Now, with his ankle fully healed, He's also been running the ball a little bit as well. He's averaged 35 rushing yards per game over that 5-game stretch. He should especially smash in week 15 against the Buccaneers. So if you have been playing Justin Herbert, I know he had a slow start to the year, picked him up, streamed him, stashed him, whatever. This is the time to play him. Fire him up through the fantasy playoffs. I like Justin Herbert over the next 4 weeks. Now, I know we talked about like the Raiders and the Cowboys. So let's actually go real quick. A few quarterbacks who actually are usable in fantasy football, who have favorable schedules. That's Baker Mayfield. He has the 7th easiest schedule. Chargers, Cowboys, Panthers. Kyler Murray has the 8th easiest schedule. Patriots, Panthers, Rams. And then Bo Nix. Bo Nix has the 9th easiest schedule for quarterbacks during the fantasy playoffs. It's the Colts, Chargers, and then the Bengals in week 17. Fire up Bo Nix in the fantasy playoffs, in the fantasy championship round, especially. Let's ride, baby. Let's ride with Bo Nix. Tight end position, easiest schedule for tight ends during the fantasy playoffs. That is the Tennessee Titans. They got the Bengals, who are the 8th easiest matchup for the position in week 15. Colts, 2nd easiest matchup in week 16. And the Jaguars are the 6th easiest matchup in week 17 for the tight end position. Now, of course, we're taking advantage of this with Chigaquanquo. He's had a handful of usable weeks this year. It's kind of extremely hard to predict when he will perform, but if you need a desperation streamer in the fantasy playoffs, Chigaquanquo, he should at least be on the radar. You can consider him because of these great matchups. The 2nd easiest schedule for the tight end position are the Seahawks, Packers in week 15, Vikings in week 16, then they get the Bears in week 17. Those are all top 15 matchups, and the Packers especially are a top 5 matchup for the tight end position. Now, we're looking at Noah Fant, looking at AJ Barner. These are probably just desperation streamers only, but if you're in that situation, maybe you consider these guys with these matchups. The 3rd easiest schedule for the tight end position in the fantasy playoffs are the New Orleans Saints. It's the Commanders in week 15. Then it's 2 top 5 matchups for the position in week 16 with the Packers and week 17 with the Raiders. Take advantage of this with Juwan Johnson. Juwan Johnson, he doesn't really get a lot of action, but he's one of the few healthy pass catchers left for the Saints in that offense, especially now that Taysom Hill is going to be out for the year. If you're streaming the position, Juwan Johnson should be a consideration for you in week 16 and week 17 because of those matchups. The 4th easiest schedule for the tight end position in the fantasy playoffs are the Cleveland Browns. They get the Chiefs in week 15. Chiefs are tough against the run game, but they are exploitable for tight ends. They have not performed very well against the tight end position this year. They're the 3rd easiest matchup for tight ends. That's the Bengals in week 16. They're the 8th easiest matchup. And the Dolphins, who are the 10th easiest matchup for the tight end position in week 17. Take advantage of this with David Njoku. David Njoku has been absolutely thriving with Jameis Winston at quarterback. He's going to be one of the best tight ends in the fantasy playoffs. We saw the Bengals in week 7. David Njoku carved them up for 10 receptions, 76 yards in a week. He'll see them again in the semifinals. I'm going to say that one more time because I think my camera cut out or something happened. So David Njoku, he's been thriving, one of the best fantasy tight ends in the fantasy playoffs. When he saw the Bengals in week 7, David Njoku carved them up for 10 receptions, 76 yards, and a touchdown. He was the tight end 1 on the week. He'll see them again in the semifinals of the fantasy playoffs. Fire up David Njoku throughout the fantasy playoffs. He could win your championship. Now, the fifth easiest schedule for the tight end position in the fantasy playoffs are the Arizona Cardinals. They got the Patriots in week 15, the Panthers with the number one easiest schedule for the position in week 16, and the Rams in week 17. I really don't need to tell you to fire up Trey McBride, but Trey McBride, top 3 tight end in fantasy, and that's despite not scoring a receiving touchdown all season long. He has like 73 receptions. Not a single one of them resulted in a touchdown. That's wild, absolutely wild. He's going to continue to carve up every defense he sees. And what happens? What happens if he starts scoring touchdowns? He's going to break fantasy football. He's going to win championships for everyone who's playing him. Fire up Trey McBride. He could be a league winner. How about the toughest schedules in the fantasy playoffs? This is according to strength of schedule tool at draftsharks.com. Check that out. The toughest schedule for the running back position in the fantasy playoffs, that is the Pittsburgh Steelers. They get the Eagles in week 15. They are the 5th toughest matchup for the running back position. And this is the Ravens in week 16. They're the 9th toughest matchup for the running back position. And then the Chiefs in week 17. They are the number 1 toughest matchup for the running back position. I'm a little nervous. if I'm rostering Najee Harris or Jaylen Warren. This is already a split backfield with both of these running backs fighting for every single touch. And don't forget, Arthur Smith likes to splash in a little bit of Cordero Patterson as well. I'm nervous for both Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren. This is a really, really brutal fantasy playoff schedule for Steelers running backs. The Bears week 15 and week 16, DeAndre Swift is already losing goal line work to Roschon Johnson. And the last time he saw the Vikings, which was in week 12, he scored 9 point. The Lions in week 13, he scored 9 week 16. So good luck if you're relying on DeAndre Swift for the fantasy playoffs. I'd be nervous about that one. The third most difficult schedule in the fantasy playoffs for the running back position are the Houston Texans. The Dolphins in week 15, they're a fine matchup. I'm fine playing Joe Mixon against the Dolphins. He should do well against that. But then you get to the semifinals. Week 16, it's the Chiefs. The Chiefs are the most difficult matchup for the running back position. And the Ravens in week 17. The Ravens struggle against the passing game, but they thrive against the running game. They're a top 10 most difficult matchup for the running back position. Obviously, this is going to impact Joe Mixon. Joe Mixon has been one of the best picks from the middle rounds of fantasy drafts this year. He's been fantastic. People are riding him. People who drafted Joe Mixon, they're probably already clinched the fantasy playoffs. They're in. Now, his workload has been pretty elite. He's looked as good as he has in years. Joe Mixon has been fantastic. He should be fine. Like I said, he should be fine in week 15 against the Dolphins, but I fear he's going to have a really hard time getting going in both the semifinals and the finals. These are really, really tough matchups against the Chiefs and the Ravens. Just beware. Beware of Joe Mixon if you've been riding him. Temper your expectations in those 2 weeks. The fourth most difficult schedule for the running back position in the fantasy playoffs are the Cleveland Browns. Week 15, there they are again. It's the Kansas City Chiefs. the number one most difficult matchup for the running back position. And it's the Bengals in week 16. They're the 8th most difficult. And the Dolphins, like I just mentioned, they're a fine matchup. I'm not worried about them. We're not getting much production out of this backfield right now anyway, to be honest with you. We're really not. It's kind of been an ugly split between two inefficient runners. Nick Chubb has looked like a shell of his former self, and Jerome Ford needs volume to produce meaningful fantasy production. They're a complete stay away in week 15 against the Chiefs, and they're like against the Bengals as well. I don't want any Browns running backs in the fantasy playoffs. Don't want them. Don't want them. The 5th most difficult schedule for the running back position in the fantasy playoffs are the Buffalo Bills. Week 15, it's the Lions. They are the 2nd most difficult matchup for the running back position. That's the Patriots in week 16. The Patriots, you can take advantage of the Patriots. They're not a tough match. The Jets in week 17 in the fantasy championship week, they are the 11th most difficult matchup for the running back position. Obviously, this is going to impact James. Could also impact Ray Davis if you're relying on him, or if something happens to James Cook and all of a sudden Ray Davis is the starter. This could be a little bit of a tough road for him. The Lions have been one of the stingiest defenses against the run all season. They're going to see them in week 15. Part of that is because they're just good, for one, but also the Detroit offense is so good that they force opposing teams to throw the ball more than they would like to. So I would be nervous as a James Cook manager for week 15. However, week 16, week 17, I really wouldn't hesitate to roll them out there despite those matchups. The Patriots, they're not a difficult matchup to begin with, like I said. And the Bills running backs combined for 131 rushing yards against the Jets back in week 6. So despite the tough matchup, we've already seen them succeed against the Jets. That makes me feel better. It does. All right. The most difficult wide receiver schedule in the fantasy playoffs, that's the Detroit Lions. The Lions have the toughest schedule in the fantasy playoffs for wide receivers. Week 15 is the Bills, who are the 11th most difficult matchup for the position. The Bears in week 16, they are the 3rd most difficult matchup for wide receivers. And it's the 49ers who are the 2nd most difficult matchup for wide receivers. They're going to get them in the fantasy championship round. This is going to impact Amon-Ra St. Brown. It's going to impact Jameson Williams. Obviously, we're not sitting a stud like Amon-Ra St. Brown, but I would be concerned about Jameson Williams, particularly in an outdoor road matchup against the Bears in week 16. And given how often Amon-Ra St. Brown lines up in the slot, it's likely we're going to see Jameson Williams get a lot of Jalen Johnson in that matchup as well. So while I'm not benching Amon-Ra St. Brown in these games, I'm probably benching Jameson Williams in week 16 against the Bears. Don't play him in that game. That is one of these that I feel the most confident. Don't play Jameson Williams in week 16. Find somebody else for the semifinals. The 2nd most difficult schedule for the wide receiver position in the fantasy playoffs are the Los Angeles Rams. They get the 49ers in week 15. They're the 2nd most difficult matchup for the position. The Jets are the 4th most difficult. They get them in week 16. And the Cardinals in week 17. They're the 13th most difficult matchup for the position. Players impacted by this are going to be Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, and maybe a little Demarcus Robinson if you've been playing him at all. Probably not, though. I wouldn't recommend sitting either Cooper Kupp or Puka Nacua, but you may want to at least temper your expectations. They're both very, very capable of overcoming tough matchups. So I'm not too worried about this, but just at least be aware. Temper your expectations slightly for Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp in the fantasy playoffs. And the 3rd most difficult wide receiver schedule in the fantasy playoffs, that goes to the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jaguars play the Jets in week 15. They're the 4th most difficult matchup for the position. That's the Raiders in week 16. They're the 10th most difficult. And the Titans in week 17, they are the 7th most difficult matchup for the position. That's going to impact Brian Thomas Jr. and Parker Washington. It's going to be a tough stretch for Jacksonville pass catchers, especially if they're quarterbacked by Mac Jones. The fourth most difficult playoff schedule for the wide receiver position, that goes to the Minnesota Vikings. They get the Bears in week 15, the Seahawks in week 16, and the Packers, who are the ninth most difficult matchup for the wide receiver position, that they get them in week 17, fantasy championship week. Of course, Vikings wide receivers, Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison. No one is sitting Justin Jefferson, no matter the matchup. And Jordan Addison, he's been kind of hot over the last several weeks. Now, both of these guys had more than 70 receiving yards and a touchdown earlier this season against the Packers. So I'm not worried about that matchup too much. However, just 2 weeks ago against the Bears, Justin Jefferson got the Jalen Johnson treatment. He was held to 2 catches for 27 yards in that game. So while we're not sitting Justin Jefferson, I'd be nervous if I'm playing him and relying on him in week 15. Hopefully you secure that first round bye this week so you don't have to worry about that. Now, in that same game, while Justin Jefferson was getting the Jalen Johnson treatment, Jordan Addison was taking full advantage on the other side. He caught 8 of 9 targets for 162 yards and a touchdown. So maybe, despite the difficult matchup, you might actually want to fire up Jordan Addison in week 15 against the Bears. See if you can take advantage of that again. Now, the fifth most difficult schedule for the wide receiver position in the fantasy playoffs, that is the Indianapolis Colts. They get the Broncos in week 15. Then it's the Titans in week 16. They're the 7th most difficult matchup for the position. And then it's the Giants in week 17. They're the 8th most difficult matchup for the wide receiver position. This is going to impact Josh Downs, Michael Pittman, Alec Pierce, Adonai Mitchell. Now, Anthony Richardson, he's played better, but he's still throwing like a below average quarterback. That's not going to bode well for a road matchup against Patrick Surtain in week 15. That's not going to be good. Now, it was Joe Flacco at the helm when they last saw the Titans earlier in the season, but he was held to 189 yards and only one Colts pass catcher was able to even reach 50 yards in that game. That was Josh Downs. He got to 66. But I'm very fearful if I'm relying on Colts wide receivers for the fantasy playoffs. This is going to be a difficult stretch for them. Now let's get to the quarterback position. The toughest schedule for quarterbacks in the fantasy playoffs, that is going to be the Detroit Lions. They play the Bills in week 15. They're the 2nd most difficult matchup for the position. Then in week 16, it's the Bears, who are the 5th most difficult matchup for the quarterback position. And then in week 17, it is the 49ers, who are the 6th most difficult matchup for quarterbacks so far this season. This is going to impact Jared Goff. It's going to be a tough stretch for Lions passing game. It's really going to. Now, the running backs are going to thrive. We talked about that. The running backs are going to thrive during this stretch. Passing game, maybe not so much. Maybe not so much. The second most difficult matchup or schedule in the fantasy playoffs for the quarterback position, that's actually the Patriots. Now, when I first looked at this schedule, I was like, you know what? This is probably a pretty decent schedule for them. But when you actually dig into the numbers, it's the 2nd most difficult schedule for the quarterback position. It's the Cardinals in week 15. They're the 12th most difficult matchup for quarterbacks. The Bills in week 16. They're the 2nd most difficult matchup for the position. And the Chargers are the 9th most difficult matchup for the quarterback position. Now, Drake May, he has exceeded all expectations, but he's going to be truly tested during the fantasy playoffs. If you've been streaming him, you may want to look elsewhere. I don't think this is a nail in the coffin. This is the death sentence for Drake May, especially with how often he's been running the ball. But it's something to at least keep in the back of your mind. There could be some tough matchups here for Drake May. The third most difficult schedule in the fantasy playoffs for the quarterback position are the San Francisco 49ers. It's the Rams in week 15, who are the 15th most difficult matchup for the position. Not too worried about that. Then it's the Dolphins in week 16. They're the fourth most difficult matchup for the quarterback position. And it's the Lions in week 17, who rank as the 10th most difficult matchup for quarterbacks. That's obviously going to impact Brock Purdy. If you thought things couldn't get any worse for the 49ers, here's that schedule. Here's that schedule with a bad shoulder to go along with it. So keep that in mind. If you are playing Brock Purdy, it might be time to look somewhere else. The fourth most difficult schedule in the fantasy playoffs for the quarterback position are the Minnesota Vikings, the Bears in week 15, the Seahawks in week 16, and the Packers in week 17. Sam Darnold, he was the QB6 against the Bears in week 12, and he was the QB9 against the Packers in week 4. So it's going to be tough to replicate that, but I don't really see any real reason to shy away from Sam Darnold if you've been relying on him at this point. I'm more worried about him turning back into Sam Darnold than these matchups. So I'm okay if you want to keep rolling with Darnold. The fifth most difficult schedule in the fantasy playoffs for the quarterback position, that is the Seattle Seahawks. In week 15, they get the Packers, who present the seventh most difficult matchup for the position. Week 16, it's the Vikings. Week 17, it's the Bears. This is going to be a brutal stretch for the Seahawks passing game. Geno Smith has had success against a few tough secondaries this season, but he's also had some down weeks against tough secondaries as well. He actually hasn't been any better than the QB 20 since week 9. So he had a pretty good start to the season. It's kind of been falling off as of late. So you might want to look elsewhere if you've been relying on Geno Smith. Let's finish it up with the tight end position, the toughest schedule for tight ends. That goes to the Indianapolis Colts, but there's no relevant Colts tight end, so we're just going to move right past them. The second most difficult schedule for the tight end position in the fantasy playoffs, that's the Patriots. Cardinals are the 14th most difficult matchup for the position. The Bills in week 16, they're the fifth most difficult matchup for the tight end position. And the Chargers are the second most difficult matchup for tight ends. They get them in week 17. Now, Hunter Henry, he's the number one option in the Patriots passing game. So he should still get there on volume despite the matchups. I'm going to keep playing Hunter Henry. The third most difficult schedule for the tight end position, that's the Buffalo Bills. They get the Lions in week 15. The Patriots are a fine matchup in week 16, but the Jets are also another tough matchup in week 17. Dalton Kincaid, he's been one of the biggest disappointments in fantasy football this year. That's more of a reason not to play him than this schedule. But it could also impact Dawson Knox as well if Kincaid remains out. The fourth most difficult schedule for tight ends in the fantasy playoffs, that's the Los Angeles Rams. The Rams get the 49ers in week 15. That's the fourth most difficult matchup for the tight end position. The Jets in week 16, and then the Cardinals in week 17. You really shouldn't be starting any Rams tight ends anyway, but if you're rolling with Colby Parkinson or you threw a dart at Dennis Allen, maybe it's time to move off of those guys. And then the fifth most difficult matchup for the tight end position in the fantasy playoffs, that is the Baltimore Ravens. They get the Giants in week 15. The Giants have been the number one most difficult matchup for the tight end position. So be wary of Mark Andrews, Isaiah Likely in week 15. The Steelers are fine in week 16, but the Texans have been a top 10 matchup or top 10 most difficult matchup for the tight end position. They get them in the fantasy championship week. Now, Mark Andrews has been coming on in the second half after slow starts to the year. Now, we look at that Steelers matchup. In week 11, he was held to just 2 catches for 22 yards on 3 targets. So even though that hasn't been like historically over the course of the season against a bunch of different opponents, a tough matchup, it was earlier in the year for Mark Andrews. So at least just keep this in mind if you've been relying on Mark Andrews or you've been throwing some darts. Isaiah Likely, this is a difficult stretch matchups-wise for Ravens tight ends. But that's our show. We'll grab a couple quick questions in the chat if we have any. I honestly didn't expect that show to be that long. A lot of talking. My voice is as dry as it's ever been. But we got through it. We got through it. So why don't we just grab a couple quick questions here? We're still under an hour. Not too bad. Let's see. Brandon is asking, I'm 10-3. This isn't even a question. Brandon's just bragging that he's 10-3 and 9-4 in his two 12-man leagues. Great job, Brandon. Great job, Brandon. Hope that means you've been following yards per fantasy throughout the year, looking at our rankings, checking out our videos, articles, content, trade calculator, start sit tool, everything we got at yardsperfantasy.com. Great job. Manning is asking, should we drop Quentin Johnson for Nick Westbrook-Akine? Yes, of course. We talked about the favorable matchups. We talked about the favorable schedule for Nick Westbrook-Akine. The targets have been there. He's been a touchdown machine. Ride him while he's hot, baby. Ride him while he's hot. And then Tyler is asking a defense question. Seahawks or the Bills? I don't know if this is in reference to this week, if this is in reference to rest of season. I'm not sure what it's in reference to. Tyler, help me out here. Help me out. I don't even know the matchups for week 14, whatever week we're in right now. Off the top of my head, I got to look that up. Seahawks are playing. Hold up. Tyler's making me do some work. Tyler's making me do work. Let's see. Seahawks are playing the Cardinals on the road, and the Bills are playing the Rams on the road. So I would rather play the Seahawks defense. I'm not a really good person to ask defense questions to be honest with you. I don't play in any leagues that actually play defenses, and I don't rank defenses. I rank quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. So I'm kind of out of touch with how defenses are playing. So we'll see. I would just off the top of my head, without really diving too deep into it, I would play the Seahawks going against the Cardinals. It's just so much more likely that the Cardinals are able to shut down. I mean, the Seahawks are able to shut down Kyler Murray and the Cardinals. They just did it 2 weeks ago. And Kyler Murray is so much more, turnover prone and sack prone than a guy like Matthew Stafford with those two wide receivers out there, Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, Kyron Williams, Blake Corum on the backfield. I'd rather just play the Seahawks defense. But again, probably want to get a second opinion on that. All right. That's our show. I am going to cut this into a couple individual videos because it was kind of long. I'll upload them as well. So if you missed part of the show, I'm going to upload just the easiest schedules and then separate just the difficult schedules as two separate videos. And then we'll be back on Saturday night. We've got 2 shows on Saturday as usual, plus the Start Sit show on Sunday. Appreciate Brandon, appreciate Manning, Tyler, everybody who tuned in. And yeah, see you guys next time.